The autumn air in the high basin carried the first premonition of winter, a sharp, sterile bite that promised hardship. Inside the town hall, the air was thick with the scent of pine floorboards, stale wood smoke, and self-righteousness. Finn stood before the council table, a boy of 18 years made to feel like a child of 8. His hands, already calloused from a life of work, were clenched at his sides. Across the table, Mr. Croft, a man whose prosperity was measured in land and livestock and whose authority was absolute, steepled his fingers. His face was a mask of placid, unmovable judgment. He was not a cruel man by reputation, merely a practical one, and his practicality was about to fall on Finn like a headsman's axe. The other men at the table, ranchers, and the town merchant, avoided Finn's gaze, their faces set in the familiar compliance of those who know their place. They were the silent enablers, the jury that had decided the verdict long before the trial began. "Son," Mr. Croft began, the word a condescending preamble, "we all feel for your loss. Your parents were good people. But this is not a land for sentiment. It is a land of realities." He paused, letting the weight of the word realities settle in the quiet room. "The reality is, you are a boy alone. That claim of yours, the cabin, it requires a man's strength and a family's resources to hold through a winter. We've seen it 100 times. A hard freeze comes, the supplies run thin, and we find a lonely soul come spring, frozen in his bed." The words were meant to sound like concern, a paternal warning, but they were a condemnation. They were the legal and social framework for taking what was his. Finn's jaw tightened. He wanted to shout about the work he'd already done, the wood he'd chopped, the repairs he'd made to the cabin roof. He wanted to tell them he was not some greenhorn from the east, this land was the only home he had ever known. He had learned its rhythms from his father, its secrets from his mother. But he knew it was useless. Their minds were as set as the granite peaks that ringed the valley. Mr. Croft continued, his voice smooth and final. "Therefore, the council has decided it is in the best interest of the community, and for your own safety, to reassign the claim. The Abernathy family, with their 4 strong sons, are prepared to take it over. They can make it productive. We are giving you until the first hard frost to gather your personal effects and move into town. We can find you work at the livery." It was an eviction notice wrapped in a flimsy blanket of charity. He was being erased from his own life. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the nervous cough of the merchant. Finn looked from face to face, searching for a flicker of doubt, of empathy, of fairness. He found none. He saw only the cold calculus of survival, where the herd cuts the weak one loose for its own good. He felt a coldness creep into his chest that had nothing to do with the coming winter. It was the chill of absolute abandonment. He gave a single, curt nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. He would not give them the satisfaction of an argument. He would not beg. He turned without a word and walked out of the hall, the weight of their silent, collective judgment pressing on his back like a physical force. The door clicked shut behind him, sealing the verdict. The walk back to the cabin was a blur of dust and muted afternoon light. Each step away from the town felt like a step into a void. The council's decision wasn't just the loss of a home, it was a declaration that he was insufficient, that his existence was a problem to be managed. He reached the small, weathered structure, built by his father's own hands, and stood before it. It seemed smaller now, more vulnerable against the vast, indifferent landscape. This was where his mother had planted her small garden of hardy herbs, where his father had sat on the porch, explaining the constellations. Now, it was just a box of wood and memories that no longer belonged to him. For a long hour, he did nothing. He simply stood there, letting the desolation wash over him. The anger, hot and sharp in the town hall, had cooled into a dense, heavy stone of despair in his gut. To leave meant accepting their verdict, admitting he was the boy they saw him as. It meant becoming a stable hand, living on charity, watching the Abernathy boys chop his wood and sleep under his roof. The thought was intolerable, a humiliation that felt worse than starvation. He began to walk, not towards the cabin door to pack, but around the perimeter of the small plot of land that was his by right, if not by the town's decree. His feet traced the familiar path worn into the soil by his family's daily life. He walked past the woodpile, stacked high and neat. He walked past the empty animal pen. He walked to the back of the cabin, where the land sloped gently upwards into a rocky hillside. And then he stopped. A memory surfaced, clear and distinct. It was from a late autumn 2 years prior. He and his father had been digging a new drainage ditch to divert the spring melt. His father had plunged the spade into the earth on this very slope and then paused, pulling his hand back. "Feel that," he'd said, his voice filled with a quiet curiosity. Still warm, Finn had pressed his own palm to the freshly turned soil. It was true. While the air was cold enough to make their breath mist, the earth just a foot down held a strange, persistent warmth, like a sleeping animal. It was a geological quirk, his father had mused, some trick of the sun on the dark rock and the insulating quality of the deep soil. At the time, it had been a simple curiosity. Now, standing on that same spot, with the sentence of exile hanging over him, the memory was a spark in the darkness. An idea, wild and desperate, began to form. It was a plan born not of hope, but of pure, stubborn defiance. They wanted him gone by the first frost. They expected him to vanish, to become another sad story told around the winter stove. He would vanish, but not in the way they expected. He would not leave. He would go down. The work began the next morning before the sun had even crested the eastern peaks. There was no grand design, no carefully drawn plan, only a frantic, desperate urgency. He chose a spot at the rear of the cabin, where the foundation was partially set into the rising slope. Prying away the skirting boards, he exposed the dark, packed earth beneath the floor joists. His tools were meager, a spade with a handle worn smooth by his father's hands, a heavy pickaxe, and a collection of sturdy buckets. The first cut into the earth was a declaration of war against the council's verdict. The ground was hard, a crust of dry topsoil and tangled roots. For hours, all he accomplished was a shallow scrape, a pathetic dent in the unyielding land. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His back screamed in protest. Every muscle ached with the unfamiliar, punishing strain. Doubt was a constant, whispering companion. This was madness. A boy could not dig a cave. He should be packing his few belongings, swallowing his pride, and heading for the livery. But then he would picture Mr. Croft's placid, certain face, and the anger would return, fueling his muscles. He was not just digging a hole, he was clawing out a space where their judgment could not reach him. Day after day, the ritual was the same. Wake before dawn, eat a cold biscuit, and descend into the growing pit. The rhythm of it took over, the jarring shock of the pickaxe, the scrape of the spade, the grunt of hoisting another bucket of dirt. He worked with a feverish intensity, hauling the earth out and dumping it in a low, wide pile behind a cluster of boulders 100 yards away, hoping it would look like a natural slide of scree. He learned the language of the earth beneath his home. The first 2 feet were a stubborn mix of clay and rock that fought him for every inch. But then, a change. The soil became looser, sandier, interspersed with layers of fine, crumbly shale. The digging became easier. The spade sank in with a satisfying sigh, and the buckets filled faster. It was a small victory, a geological gift, but it felt like the first nod of approval from the land itself. It was proof that something here was different, that this patch of ground held a secret. He was no longer just fighting the council, he was collaborating with the earth. The pit grew, becoming a small cavern. He worked by the light of a single lantern, its glow casting his long, distorted shadow against the earthen walls. Down here, the world was reduced to the immediate and the physical, the ache in his shoulders, the smell of damp soil, the rhythmic sound of his own breathing. The world above, the town, the council, the coming frost, began to feel distant and unreal. This subterranean space was becoming his reality, a world he was creating with his own 2 hands, inch by painful inch. As the hole deepened, transforming from a pit into a genuine cavern beneath the cabin's rear floor, he began to notice the change. Above ground, the nights were growing colder. A sharp frost now silvered the grass each morning, and the wind carried the scent of snow from the high peaks. But down in his excavation, the air was different. It was utterly still, shielded from the wind that rattled the cabin's windows. More than that, it was temperate. He would climb out of the hole in the pre-dawn chill, his body shivering in the cold air, and then descend back into it to feel a palpable, consistent mildness. The earthen walls around him were not cold to the touch. They radiated a faint, steady warmth, like a hearth whose embers had been banked for the night. He would stand in the center of the dark space, the lantern extinguished, and just feel it. It was the memory of his father's discovery made real. The earth beneath him was a vast, natural reservoir. All summer long, the sun had baked the dark soil and rock of the hillside, and that heat had sunk deep into the ground. Now, the thick layers of soil and clay were acting as a massive insulator, trapping the summer's warmth and preventing the winter's cold from penetrating more than a few feet. He was digging his way into a stable, geothermal pocket, a place where the seasons had less power. He began to think of it not as digging down, but as digging into the heart of a gentle, life-preserving warmth. This understanding shifted everything. He wasn't just carving out a hiding place to weather the winter like a hibernating bear. He was creating an environment, a pocket of defiance against the climate itself. The project took on a new dimension, one of scientific curiosity mixed with a desperation for survival. He started paying closer attention, making small experiments. He left a bucket of water down in the cavern overnight. The next morning, the water in the horse trough outside was filled with ice, but the water in the bucket was still liquid, cool but not frozen. He realized that as long as he could keep the cold air from the outside from pouring in, he could maintain this bubble of temperate stability. The challenge was no longer just about digging, it was about engineering. He needed a door, a seal. He needed to manage the air. His work became more precise, more thoughtful. He stopped digging aimlessly and began to shape the space, widening it into a rectangular room directly beneath the main room of the cabin. He used salvaged planks from an old collapsed shed to begin shoring up the ceiling, bracing them against the cabin's floor joists. Each piece of wood he set in place felt like a sentence in an argument he was building against Mr. Croft. The council saw a boy who couldn't survive the winter in a cabin. They never thought to look under it. The hope that sparked within him was no longer the frantic, desperate hope of a cornered animal. It was a grounded, intelligent hope, born of observation and hard-won understanding. He had found an advantage, a secret hidden in plain sight, and it belonged to him alone. He worked with a new, focused purpose. The frantic digging gave way to a more measured construction. The space beneath the cabin became his entire world. He expanded it carefully, creating a main chamber roughly 10 by 12 feet, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. He learned the art of bracing, using stout timbers wedged into the earth to support the tons of soil above. It was slow, terrifying work, a single miscalculation could bring the whole thing down. But fear was a luxury he couldn't afford. He reinforced the walls with a lattice of salvaged wood, creating a rustic but solid framework. The entrance was a low, narrow tunnel leading out from under the cabin's foundation to a spot concealed by a thicket of overgrown brush. He fashioned a heavy, insulated door from 3 layers of planking stuffed with dried moss, fitting it so snugly that it sealed the precious warmth inside. Then came the breakthrough, the idea that elevated his project from mere survival to something more. He was sorting through the last of his parents' possessions, deciding what little he could keep, when he found them, a small cloth sack containing his mother's saved seeds. There were hardy beans and potatoes, of course, but also a paper packet of tomato seeds and another of lettuce. To plant them outside now would be to condemn them to immediate death. But down here, in the constant, gentle warmth, could it be possible? The thought took root and grew with astonishing speed. He could create a garden underground. He spent a week building shallow wooden crates from the last of his scavenged planks. He filled them with the richest topsoil he could find, hauling it in bucket by bucket. He arranged them in neat rows in his subterranean room, a bizarre and hopeful little farm. Using his lantern for light, he carefully planted the seeds. It felt like an act of mad faith, entrusting these tiny specks of life to the darkness and the earth's strange warmth. As the first snows of winter began to dust the high country, the town council likely assumed he was long gone, another footnote in the valley's harsh history. The Abernathy family, waiting for the official transfer of the claim, would ride by occasionally, seeing the cold chimney and the snow-covered porch, and report back that the cabin was abandoned. But beneath their feet, in the dim, steady glow of his lantern, Finn was watching the miracle unfold. Pale green shoots pushed their way up through the dark soil. The potato slips sent out tentative leaves, the lettuce began to form small, delicate heads, and the tomato seedlings, spindly and pale, reached for the warm air. He survived that first winter in a state of suspended animation. He was lean, for his diet consisted mostly of potatoes and dried meat, but he was alive. He was a ghost in his own home, a secret dweller in the warm heart of the frozen land. Spring arrived with the slow, grudging retreat of the snow. The world above ground thawed, and Finn emerged from his subterranean sanctuary like a creature from hibernation. He was thinner, his face pale, but his eyes held a new hardness, a quiet confidence forged in solitude and success. The underground garden had produced. It wasn't a bountiful harvest, the lack of direct sunlight kept the plants from thriving as they would have topside, but it was enough. He had eaten fresh greens in January, a luxury no one else in the valley, not even Mr. Croft, could claim. He spent the summer living a double life. By day, he worked outside, cultivating a small, well-hidden garden in a sunny patch shielded by boulders, letting the cabin appear deserted to any distant observer. By night, he worked on his underground world, expanding it, digging a new chamber for storage and improving the ventilation with a clever system of small, concealed pipes. But a secret as profound as a living man in a dead man's cabin is hard to keep. Small signs, almost imperceptible, began to accumulate. A wisp of smoke from the chimney on a windless evening. A footprint found near the creek that didn't match any known boot. The Abernathy boys, growing impatient, reported that while the cabin looked abandoned, it didn't feel right. It didn't have the air of decay they expected. Rumors began to circulate in town, whispers of a squatter, or perhaps even Finn's ghost, haunting the claim. These whispers reached the ears of Abel, a man who lived apart from the town's social ecosystem. Abel was a trapper and prospector who had spent 40 years in the mountains, a man whose face was a roadmap of harsh seasons and whose hands were gnarled but immensely capable. He had a quiet respect for those who could survive on their own terms and a deep disdain for the town council's brand of committee-driven cruelty. He had known Finn's father and considered him a decent, honest man. The rumors piqued his weathered curiosity. One crisp autumn afternoon, he decided to see for himself. He didn't ride up to the cabin directly. He approached from the high ground, moving with the silence of a man accustomed to stalking game. He lay on a ridge for an hour, watching the cabin through an old spyglass. He saw nothing. Then, just as he was about to dismiss the rumors, he saw it, a flicker of movement near the woodpile. It was Finn, emerging from the trees, carrying a freshly cut log. He moved with a purpose and strength that belied the town's image of a helpless boy. Abel watched, intrigued, as Finn carried the wood not to the front door, but around to the back of the cabin, where he disappeared. Abel decided a direct approach was needed. He made his way down the slope, his steps deliberate and loud, giving the boy plenty of warning. Finn heard the approaching footsteps and his heart leaped into his throat. He froze, hidden behind the cabin, his hand instinctively gripping the handle of his axe. His first thought was that it was the Abernathys, or worse, Croft, coming to finally and formally evict him. He peered around the corner of the cabin and saw a tall, grizzled man with a long rifle slung over his shoulder. He didn't recognize him from town. The man stopped about 30 yards away, making no move to come closer. "Just taking a walk," the old man called out, his voice a low gravelly rumble. "Didn't expect to find anyone home." Finn remained silent, his mind racing. The man didn't look like he was from the council. There was a different quality to him, less official, more elemental. Abel stood his ground, patient. "They say in town this place is empty. Say the boy who lived here ran off." Finn finally spoke, his voice tight. "They say a lot of things in town." Abel allowed a small, dry smile to touch his lips. "That they do. Most of it not worth the breath it takes to say it." He took a few slow steps forward, his hands in plain sight. "I knew your father. He was a good man. didn't believe he'd raised a son who would cut and run. The mention of his father disarmed Finn slightly. He lowered the axe, though he kept it in his hand. "What do you want?" Abel's gaze was sharp, taking in the neat woodpile, the subtle signs of occupation. "Just satisfying my curiosity. The town wrote you off." "Seems they were wrong." He paused. "It's getting cold. A man alone needs more than just wood to get through a winter up here." It was a statement of fact, but also an opening. Finn was wary. His solitude had bred a deep-seated distrust of everyone. But he was also practical. There were things he desperately needed: more lamp oil, a handful of nails, salt. Things he couldn't make. Abel saw the conflict in the boy's eyes. He saw the fierce independence warring with the stark reality of his needs. "I'm not with the council," Abel said, his voice softening slightly. Never cared for Croft or his pronouncements. "I'm just a man who respects ingenuity." After a long, tense silence, Finn made a decision. This man was an outsider, like him. Perhaps he could be trusted. "There's more than wood," Finn said quietly. He walked to the concealed entrance of his tunnel and pulled back the brush. He lit a lantern and gestured for Abel to follow. Abel ducked into the low tunnel, his skepticism palpable. He emerged into the main chamber and stopped dead. His jaw went slack. In the warm, still air, under the dim glow of the lantern, were rows of impossible green. Lettuce, healthy and vibrant. Potato plants, their leaves broad and dark. And in one corner, a half-dozen tomato plants, staked and tied, with small, pale green fruits hanging from their vines. Abel reached out and touched a leaf, as if to confirm it was real. He looked from the plants to Finn, his expression a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. "By God, boy," he whispered. "What have you done here?" A deal was struck, not with a handshake, but with a shared look of understanding. Abel would bring supplies, tools, oil, seeds, salt, and in return, he would have a share of the impossible winter harvest. An alliance was forged in the warm earth, a partnership of the outcasts. The alliance with Abel transformed Finn's project from a feat of desperate survival into a work of deliberate engineering. Abel was a master of improvisation, his mind a library of practical knowledge gleaned from decades of living off the land. He looked at Finn's creation not just as a shelter, but as a system that could be optimized. Their first major project was light. The lantern provided enough warmth and illumination for the plants to live, but not to thrive. "They need the sun, boy," Abel stated, chewing on a piece of dried jerky as he surveyed the underground garden. "Even a little bit will make all the difference." Getting sunlight underground seemed impossible, but Abel had an idea. He knew of an old, abandoned line shack 10 miles up the valley, used by the telegraph company years ago and now forgotten. Its windows, he recalled, were likely still intact. The two of them made the journey, a silent, purposeful trek through the autumn woods. They found the shack half collapsed, but as Abel predicted, 3 of the window panes were unbroken. They carefully removed them from their frames, wrapped them in old blankets, and carried them back like precious artifacts. The next step was the most dangerous part of the entire endeavor. They had to cut a hole in the floor of the cabin itself, directly above the garden. Using Finn's father's saw and Abel's steady hand, they painstakingly cut a rectangular opening 3 feet by 5. It was a moment of high tension. One wrong move could compromise the structural integrity of the entire cabin. But they worked slowly, bracing the joists as they went. They built a sturdy frame for the glass panes, sealing the edges with a mixture of pine pitch and clay that Abel knew how to prepare. When they were done, a rectangle of muted, glorious daylight spilled into the cavern below. It wasn't direct sunlight, but it was a diffuse, life-giving glow that transformed the space. The plants seemed to respond almost immediately, their leaves turning a deeper, healthier green. Their partnership fell into a comfortable rhythm. Abel would appear every few days, sometimes with a bag of nails he'd traded for in a distant town, another time with a roll of wire. He taught Finn how to properly brace the tunnels as he began to expand, digging a second chamber for food storage and a third, smaller one as a sleeping area, leaving the main cavern for the garden. They worked together, their movements economical and synchronized. Abel would show Finn how to notch a log for a perfect fit. Finn would show Abel the subtle changes in soil temperature that indicated the best place to dig. They spoke little, their communication flowing through shared tasks and mutual respect. Abel, a man who had been alone for most of his life, found a renewed sense of purpose. Finn, who had been abandoned by his entire community, found a mentor and an ally. Together, they were building more than just a shelter, they were building a fortress of ingenuity against the coming winter and the cold judgment of the world above. The second winter arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but like an invading army. The temperature plummeted, and a fierce, relentless wind scoured the valley. The old-timers in town nodded grimly. It was going to be a hard one, the kind that culled herds and tested souls. For weeks on end, the temperature hovered at 20 below zero, with nighttime lows dropping to a terrifying 30 below. The river froze solid, and the snow piled in deep, silent drifts against doors and windows. In the town, life contracted. Families huddled around their stoves, rationing firewood and food. The Abernethys, who had finally been granted Finn's claim, found the cabin to be a miserable, drafty box that consumed firewood at an alarming rate. Their stored vegetables froze in their cellar. They complained openly at the mercantile that the claim was cursed, that the boy had been lucky to get away. Meanwhile, 10 feet below their frozen misery, a different reality was unfolding. In the underground greenhouse, the temperature remained remarkably stable. The combination of the Earth's geothermal warmth and the insulated structure kept the air at a consistent 55 degrees. The glass panel in the floor was covered in a thick layer of snow, which muted the light but also provided another layer of perfect insulation. Life didn't just survive here, it flourished. The tomatoes, spurred on by the faint, diffuse light, began to ripen, turning a pale but unmistakable red. The lettuce was crisp and green. The potatoes, harvested from their crates, were firm and plentiful. Finn and Abel lived in a small, self-contained world of warmth and abundance. Abel would arrive covered in snow, his beard stiff with ice, and descend into the tunnel. He would emerge in the main chamber, shaking his head in disbelief every time, as if seeing it for the first time. "It's -28 up there," he said one afternoon, his voice hushed with awe. "And in here, it's spring." They ate well, their meals a stark contrast to the monotonous diet of salted meat and dried beans that the rest of the valley was enduring. The fresh greens kept them healthy, the vitamin C a potent defense against the scurvy that was beginning to afflict some of the town's more isolated families. As the brutal winter dragged on, Abel began to think about others. He knew families on the outskirts, people as independent and proud as himself, who would be suffering in silence. He approached Finn with a proposition. It was time to let a few trusted people in on the secret. Finn was hesitant, the wound of his public rejection was still raw. But he trusted Abel's judgment. The first to be invited were the Millers, a quiet family with 3 young children whose small homestead was in a particularly wind-blasted corner of the valley. Abel brought the father, a stoic man named Thomas, to the cabin one night under the cover of a snowstorm. Like Abel, Thomas was rendered speechless by the sight of the green, living plants. He left with a sack filled with potatoes and fresh lettuce, his face a mask of stunned gratitude. He paid not with money but with a promise of silence and 2 gallons of precious lamp oil. The secret was out, but it was a shared secret now, held by a small, growing circle of outcasts who had been failed by the valley's rigid social order. The laughter that had once followed Finn's name had been replaced by something else entirely, a quiet, desperate, and hopeful whisper. The whispers grew louder than the winter wind. By the time the great thaw came, the story of the boy who farmed winter had taken on the quality of a legend. It was no longer a secret, but it wasn't public knowledge either. It was a truth shared among a select few, a piece of communal law that existed outside the official narrative dictated by the town council. Mr. Croft and his allies heard the rumors, of course, but they dismissed them as the fanciful tales of desperate people. A boy growing tomatoes in January? It was absurd. They had seen the abandoned cabin with their own eyes. Their certainty was their blindness. That spring, Finn, with Abel by his side, did not hide. He walked into town to the mercantile, not as a charity case, but as a producer. He carried a crate of late winter potatoes, firm and unblemished, and another of hardy greens. The town merchant, who had sat silently at the council table during Finn's condemnation, looked at the produce, then at Finn, and his jaw worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. He paid Finn a premium price without a word of argument. The power dynamic in the valley had subtly, irrevocably shifted. Over the next few years, Finn's method was no longer his alone. He didn't hoard his knowledge, he shared it, but only with those who asked with humility and respect. He taught Thomas Miller how to survey his own land, how to find the right slope and soil composition. He showed another family how to dig and brace a cellar, not just for storage, but for cultivation. The underground greenhouse, Finn's desperate act of defiance, became a regional innovation. Families began to build Finn cellars, modifying the design to fit their own land. The valley's relationship with winter began to change. The season was still harsh, a thing to be respected and feared, but it was no longer a 6-month sentence of deprivation. It became a second, hidden growing season. The health of the community improved. The annual scourge of scurvy all but disappeared. Children grew up eating green vegetables in the dead of winter as a matter of course. Finn, the boy who was cast out for being too weak to survive, had become the architect of the valley's resilience. He never sought revenge on Mr. Croft or the council. He didn't need to. Their authority, built on a rigid and unimaginative view of the world, simply eroded in the face of his quiet, irrefutable success. The Abernathy family abandoned the claim after 2 miserable winters, and the land was formally and quietly returned to Finn, his ownership no longer in question. He became a respected man, not for wealth or power, but for his wisdom and his deep understanding of the land's hidden strengths. His story became a lesson, passed down through generations. The solution to the biggest challenges often lies where no one else is looking, in the places that have been dismissed as worthless or impossible. It is a lesson about looking down when everyone else is looking out, about finding warmth in the cold, and about building a future in the one place you were told you could never survive. And so, the outcast became the cornerstone. This story isn't just about a boy and a hole in the ground. It's about the nature of a problem. How often are we told that the rules are fixed, that the challenge is insurmountable, that we are not equipped to face the winter ahead? How often do we accept that verdict? Think about the challenges in your own life, the ones that feel like unchangeable laws of nature. Have you looked under the floorboards? Have you tested the warmth of the earth beneath your feet? The most powerful advantages are often hidden, concealed by conventional wisdom. What verdict have you accepted about yourself that needs to be defied? What impossible garden are you meant to grow? If this story of resilience and ingenuity resonates with you, consider subscribing for more tales of those who found their own way. There is always a hidden warmth, if you are willing to dig for it.